I have a 2-pound porterhouse steak hidden inside a hollowed-out wheel of provolone cheese in my walk-in cooler. It's a beautiful cut of meat. Marbled fat, deep red, aged perfectly. 2 years ago, I would have put it in the center of my display case. I would have shouted about it to every señora walking down Court Street. I would have been proud. Today, April 1943, possession of that steak is a federal crime. If the wrong person sees it, I lose my license. If I sell it for what it's actually worth, I go to jail. So I hide it behind the cheese wheels, wiping my hands on my apron, trying to stop them from shaking. My name is Tony Moretti. I've been a butcher in Brooklyn for 30 years. My shop, Moretti's Quality Meats, is the heart of this neighborhood. Or at least it used to be. Now it feels more like a battlefield. And I'm standing on the front lines with nothing but a boning knife and a roll of brown paper. You might think you know what a shortage looks like. You go to the supermarket today, and maybe they're out of your favorite brand of chips. Maybe the eggs are expensive. You get annoyed, you move on. But you have to understand what was happening in New York City in the spring of '43. This wasn't just about running out of stock. This was a slow-motion collision between the United States government and the laws of economics. And caught right in the middle, squeezed until we couldn't breathe, were people like me. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning. The shop was crowded, but it was quiet. That's the first thing you noticed. A butcher shop should be loud. The thwack of the cleaver, the grinding of the sausage machine. People shouting orders, laughing, arguing about the Yankees. But that morning, the only sound was the shuffling of feet on the sawdust floor. The display case, my pride and joy, was embarrassing. A few trays of liver, some pig's feet, a lonely pile of bologna that looked as tired as I felt. The hooks where the sides of beef usually hung were bare, swinging slightly in the draft. I was standing at the block when Mr. Sterling walked up. Now, Mr. Sterling didn't live in the neighborhood. He drove over from the Heights. He wore a suit that cost more than my delivery truck, and he smelled like expensive tobacco. He leaned over the counter, lowering his voice so the other customers couldn't hear. He asked me if I had anything special in the back. I told him what I told everyone. I had liver, I had bologna, take your pick. He didn't look at the liver. Instead, he slid a hand across the counter. Underneath his palm was a $5 bill. You have to understand the math here. The Office of Price Administration, the OPA, said the maximum price I could charge for a steak was 45 cents a pound. 45 cents. That bill on the counter was offering 5 times the legal limit. And here's the kicker. He didn't have his ration book. No red stamps. He whispered that he was having a dinner party. Important people, war production board types. He needed 2 pounds of beef. No stamps, just cash. I looked at that $5 bill. I thought about the rent, which was due on Friday. I thought about the letter I'd just sent to my son, Joey, somewhere in the deserts of Tunisia with the infantry. I thought about how business was down 50% because I had nothing to sell. My hand twitched. It would be so easy. I could go to the cooler, move the provolone cheese, grab that porterhouse, and wrap it up. 30 seconds. $5. No one would know. But then I looked at the line behind him. Mrs. Russo was next. She was wringing her hands, staring at the empty case. She'd been coming to my shop since she was a bride. Her youngest boy, Mike, was on a destroyer in the Pacific. If I sold that steak to Sterling, I was a criminal. I was a war profiteer. I was betting against my own country. I pushed the $5 bill back across the glass. I told Mr. Sterling, loud enough for the line to hear, that he needed 16 points for a steak, and even if he had them, I didn't have the meat. He looked at me like I was an idiot. He pocketed his money, adjusted his silk tie, and walked out. He probably went 3 blocks down to the shop on Union Street. They didn't ask for stamps there if you had the cash. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I felt virtuous. I felt like a patriot. Then Mrs. Russo stepped up. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She placed her ration book on the counter. War Ration Book 2. It was worn soft at the edges. She told me her oldest was home on leave, just for 2 days. She wanted to make him a braciole. She needed flank steak or round steak, anything. She had the points, she had the money, she had the right, and I had nothing. I stood there, paralyzed. The porterhouse was in the back. It wasn't flank steak, but it was beef. I could have given it to her. I could have charged her the legal 45 cents, but I didn't. I told her I was sorry. I told her the truck hadn't come. I told her all I had was the liver. She started to cry. Not loud, just quiet, shaking tears. She asked me what she was supposed to feed a soldier on leave. Liver? I wrapped up 2 pounds of calf's liver. I didn't charge her for it. I told her to soak it in milk, fry it with onions. It would be good, I lied. It would be fine. She took the package and left. I felt sick. I had refused the bribe, yes. But I had also starved the mother of a soldier because I was hoarding that steak. Why? Was I saving it for myself? Was I waiting for a higher bidder? Or was I just terrified that if I brought it out, a riot would start? I didn't know anymore. The rules changed every day. The prices changed every week. The only thing that stayed the same was the fear. I turned to my wife, Rosa, who was manning the register. She looked at me, her face tight. She knew about the steak and the cheese wheel. She knew we could have used that $5. She didn't say anything, but I saw her glance at the ledger book open on the counter. The red ink was starting to pile up. I told her we were doing the right thing. I was trying to convince myself. She whispered back that the right thing didn't pay the landlord. I went to the back to wash my hands. The water was cold. I scrubbed until my skin was raw. I looked at the walk-in cooler door. I hated that steak. I hated that it had so much power over me. A piece of meat shouldn't make a man feel like a criminal in his own shop. That's when the bell above the front door jingled. It wasn't the soft jingle of a customer. It was the sharp, authoritative ring of trouble. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked back out to the front. The shop had gone dead silent, even quieter than before. Standing in the doorway was a man in a gray suit. He wore a fedora pulled low. He held a clipboard in one hand and a leather badge wallet in the other. He didn't look at the customers. He looked straight at the scale. Then he looked at the price list on the wall. Then he looked at me. He announced himself as the Office of Price Administration. "Routine inspection," he said. His voice was flat, bored, and dangerous. He stepped behind the counter. My blood ran cold. The cheese wheel. The porterhouse. If he checked the scale, I was fine. If he checked the register, I was fine. But if he opened that walk-in cooler, if he moved that wheel of provolone, I wasn't just looking at a fine. I was looking at a suspension order. They would padlock my doors. My family would be on the street. He walked past me, toward the back room. He told me to open the cooler. The Office of Price Administration inspector stood on the other side of my counter, tapping his pen against his clipboard. He looked at the scale. Then he looked at the empty display case. Then he looked at me. I stood there, wiping my hands on my apron, feeling the sweat trickle down my back. I was terrified. But looking at him, this little man in a gray suit who had the power to shut down my entire life, my mind didn't stay in that terrifying moment. It drifted back. It went back 4 weeks. Back to before the fear set in. Back to the noise. You have to understand what the world looked like just a month ago, in March of 1943, before the red stamps, before the shortages really bit, before the silence. They called it the panic buy. The government had announced that meat rationing would start on March 29th. They gave us a warning. They thought they were being fair, giving people time to prepare. But human nature doesn't do fair, it does survival. For that entire week leading up to the deadline, my shop wasn't a butcher shop, it was a riot zone. Imagine the busiest Black Friday sale you've ever seen, but instead of fighting over televisions, people were fighting over chuck roast and pork chops. The bell above my door didn't just ring, it jingled constantly, a manic soundtrack to the madness. I remember that last Saturday vividly. My son, Joey, was there. He hadn't shipped out to North Africa yet. He was in his uniform, pressed khaki, looking like a movie star, or at least that's what the neighborhood girls thought. He was supposed to be on leave, relaxing. Instead, he was behind the counter with me, hauling sides of beef from the cooler, his sleeves rolled up, sweating right alongside his old man. We couldn't cut the meat fast enough. Mrs. Russo, the same woman I'd turn away empty-handed a month later, was there that day. She bought 3 legs of lamb. 3. She told me she was going to salt them, freeze them, do whatever she had to do. She looked me in the eye and insisted she wasn't going to let her boys go hungry, no matter what Washington said. I tried to warn her that lamb doesn't keep forever, even in an ice box. She didn't care. No one cared about logic. They just wanted to hold the food in their hands. It was psychological. If they had the meat, they were safe. My wife, Rosa, was at the register. The cash drawer was banging open and shut so fast it sounded like a machine gun. We made more money that week than we had in the previous 6 months combined. The cash box was overflowing. But looking at Rosa, I didn't see happiness. I saw fear. She kept glancing at the empty hooks in the cooler window. She whispered to me during a lull that we were selling our inventory faster than the wholesalers could replace it. She asked what we would sell next week. I told her not to worry. I was Tony Moretti. I knew the suppliers. I knew the market. I explained that the government just wanted to make sure the boys overseas got fed, which was true, and that once the system settled down, business would go back to normal. I was naive. I was patriotic, sure, but I was stupid. See, here's the thing about the economy that most people don't get until it smacks them in the face. Prices are a signal. When everyone wants something, the price goes up. That's the law of gravity. But the government had repealed the law of gravity. They established the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. They set price ceilings. That meant no matter how many people wanted a steak, I couldn't charge a penny more than the official list price. Round steak was frozen around 45 cents a pound. Leg of lamb, 35 or so. So when you have high demand, low supply, and a fixed low price, you don't get a functioning market. You get empty shelves. And then came the points. That Sunday, when the rationing finally started, the silence in the shop was deafening. The panic was over. The reality had arrived. Every man, woman, and child in America had been issued War Ration Book 2. Inside were red stamps, marked with letters and numbers. These were your points. Here is how it worked. And pay attention because this math became more important than money. Every person got 16 red points a week. That was your budget. You could be a millionaire living on Park Avenue or a dock worker in Red Hook. You got 16 points. The problem was the cost. A pound of porterhouse steak? That cost 8 points. Now you might think, 8 points? I have 16. I can buy 2 steaks. Sure, but butter cost 8 points a pound too. Think about that equation. You have 16 points for the whole week. You want a steak dinner on Sunday? That's 8 points. You want butter for your toast and cooking for the week? That's another 8 points. That's it. That's your 16 points gone. 2 items. For 7 days. If you wanted cheese or ham or lard or canned fish, it all came out of that same 16-point budget. You had to choose. Do you want to eat meat or do you want flavor? You rarely got both. I remember explaining this to Mr. Sterling that first week. He came in, waiting for his usual order, a standing rib roast for his Sunday party. He pulled out his wallet, thick with cash, ready to pay whatever I asked. I had to stop him. I pointed to the chart on the wall. I told him his money was no good without the stamps. He laughed at first. He thought I was joking. Then he got angry. He told me he'd been a customer for 10 years. He asked if I knew who he was. I told him I knew exactly who he was, but unless he had enough points, which would take a family of 4 saving up for a week, I couldn't sell him that roast. If I did, and the OPA caught me, I'd lose my license. I'd be padlocked. He stormed out. That was the first crack in the foundation. The system was designed to be fair, to ensure that with the Army buying up 60% of the prime beef cuts, the remaining meat was shared equally among civilians. And in a way, it was beautiful. It meant the rich couldn't just buy everything while the poor starved. But for a guy like me, a butcher, it was a nightmare. I wasn't just cutting meat anymore. I was a banker. I had to collect the stamps, paste them onto gum sheets, big grids of paper, and deposit them at the bank to get credit to buy more meat from the wholesaler. If I lost the stamps, or if I accepted expired ones, I couldn't restock. And the customers, they changed. The friendly gossip stopped. People watched each other. If Mrs. Russo bought a pork loin, other customers would stare at her hands, counting the stamps she tore out, making sure she wasn't cheating. Envy is a poisonous thing, and the ration book made everyone envious. But the hardest moment wasn't the customers. It was Joey. A few days after the rationing started, right before he shipped out, he sat me down in the kitchen. He was wearing his dress uniform. He looked older than 21. He told me that he was proud of me. He said that while he was fighting in North Africa, I was holding down the fort here. He said following the rules was part of the war effort. He warned me not to let the shop change me. I promised him I wouldn't. I hugged him, smelling the wool of his uniform and the old spice he wore, and I promised him that when he came back, Moretti's quality meats would be exactly the same. I lied. I didn't mean to, but I did. Because now, standing here 4 weeks later with the OPA inspector drilling holes in me with his eyes, I knew the truth. The shop couldn't stay the same. The math didn't work. I had rent to pay, I had a cooler that cost money to run, but I could only sell a fraction of the meat I used to, at prices that barely covered the wholesale cost. The inspector took a step toward the counter. He asked to see inside the display case. He wanted to check my trim levels. He wanted to see if I was leaving too much fat on the bone to add weight, a common trick to squeeze a few extra pennies out of a sale. I opened the case. My hands were shaking. I thought about the promise I made to Joey, and then I thought about the secret compartment under the register where I had hidden a 2-pound steak wrapped in brown paper, waiting for Mr. Sterling, who had promised to come back with cash. And no points. I hadn't sold it yet, but I had cut it. I had set it aside. The before was gone. The panic buying was over. Now we were in the squeeze, and I was starting to realize that being a patriot and being a businessman might be 2 different things. You might think the hardest part of being a butcher in 1943 was dealing with the customers, the crying mothers, the angry housewives, the rich folks trying to bribe you. But you'd be wrong. The real war wasn't happening in my shop. It was happening at 4 in the morning, on the cobblestone streets of the meatpacking district in Manhattan. That's where the supply chain died. See, after that first crazy week of rationing, the panic buying, the confusion over red points, we all thought things would settle down. We thought, okay, the government has a plan. We have the stamps, we have the price ceilings. Now we just do business. I was naive. I admit that now. 2 weeks into April, I took my truck across the bridge. Usually the market is a riot of noise before dawn. Men shouting, carcasses sliding along overhead rails, the smell of raw beef and sawdust, the steam rising off the Hudson River. It's a bloody, loud, beautiful orchestra. That morning, it was quiet, ghostly quiet. I walked into the warehouse of my main wholesaler. Let's call him Mr. Miller. I'd been buying from Miller for 15 years. I paid on time. I sent him a turkey every Christmas. We were friends, or so I thought. His cooler was huge, big enough to park a bus inside. Usually, it was packed tight with sides of beef, hanging in rows like heavy red curtains. I walked in. The hooks were empty. Hundreds of steel hooks just dangling there, clinking against each other in the draft. There were maybe 3 sides of beef in the whole place. 3. For a city of 7 million people. I found Miller in his office. I asked him what was going on. I told him I had customers waiting. Mrs. Russo needed soup bones. The factory workers needed ground chuck. I had pockets full of ration points and a ledger full of cash. Miller didn't even look up from his desk. He told me there was no beef. I pointed to the 3 sides hanging in the cooler. He shook his head. Those were spoken for, he said. Hotels, restaurants, people who paid differently. This is the part where you have to understand the economics. The government, in their wisdom, had frozen the price I could charge my customers. That's a price ceiling. A sirloin steak could not be sold for more than, say, 55 cents a pound. If I charged 56, I went to jail. Fine. I'm a patriot. I follow the law. But the government hadn't frozen the costs for the farmers. Out in the Midwest, the price of corn, which you feed to cattle to make them fat, was skyrocketing. But the price the farmer could get for the cow was frozen by the OPA. Do the math. It cost the farmer more to feed the cow than he could sell it for. So, what did the farmer do? He didn't ship the cow to New York. He kept it in the field. Or he sold it to his local neighbor for cash, under the table. Or he just ate it himself. The supply line to New York City had been cut. Not by German U-boats, but by simple arithmetic. But standing there in Miller's office, I didn't care about the arithmetic. I cared about my shop. I begged him. I told him I couldn't go back to Brooklyn with an empty truck. My son was fighting in North Africa. I had a business to run. Finally, Miller looked at me. He said he could maybe help me out. He could spare 1 side of beef. 1. I felt a wave of relief. I reached for my wallet, but then he told me the condition. If I wanted that side of beef at the legal government price, I also had to buy 50 pounds of chicken feet and 20 pounds of beef lungs and a crate of lamb's heads. I stared at him. I asked him what I was supposed to do with 50 pounds of chicken feet. My customers in Carroll Gardens wanted pot roast, not soup stock for a witch's brew. He shrugged. Take it or leave it, he said. It was a tie-in sale. It was illegal, of course. The OPA said you couldn't force a customer to buy unwanted goods to get the wanted ones. But Miller knew he had me. If I reported him, I'd never get meat in this town again. I did the calculation in my head. The chicken feet were worthless to me. I'd have to throw them in the garbage. That meant the cost of the waste had to be covered by the profit from the beef. But I couldn't raise the price of the beef to cover the loss, because the OPA controlled the price of the beef. I was guaranteed to lose money on the transaction. I looked at Miller. I looked at the empty hooks. I thought about Rosa managing the register, worried about the rent. I thought about the empty display case back in Brooklyn. I told him I'd take it. I loaded the truck myself. 1 beautiful side of beef, and crates of garbage I'd have to bury in the alley so the health inspector didn't see them. Driving back across the Brooklyn Bridge, the sun was coming up. The city looked beautiful, all gold and gray. But I felt sick. This is what people don't tell you about economic collapse. It doesn't happen with an explosion. It happens with 1,000 small humiliations. It happens when honest men are forced to become liars just to stay in business. When I got back to the shop, Rosa was waiting. She saw the one side of beef and the crates of junk. She knows the business better than I do. She didn't even have to ask. She just looked at the invoice Miller gave me, which, of course, only listed the beef, because putting the chicken feet on paper would be evidence of a crime. She did the math on the back of an envelope. She told me we lost $12 just by opening the doors today. I slammed my hand on the cutting block. I shouted that it was temporary. It had to be. The government would fix it. They had to fix it. You can't starve New York City. But the customers started coming in at 8 a.m., and that's when the real squeeze started. I had to cut that single side of beef into miracles. Mrs. Moretti, no relation, just a common name, came in wanting a roast for Sunday. I had to tell her I only had stew meat. She looked at me like I was hoarding the good stuff for myself. Then Mr. Sterling came in. He's a lawyer from the Heights. Drives a big Packard. He leaned over the counter, dropped his voice low. He asked if I had anything special in the back. He didn't care about points, he said. He had cash. I looked at the pathetic row of cuts in my case. I looked at the red points poster on the wall with the patriotic eagle on it. I told him no. I told him what you see is what I have. He looked at me with this pitying expression. He told me that the butcher on Court Street had steaks. He told me that if I wasn't careful, the world was going to pass me by. He left without buying anything. I watched him go, and I realized something terrifying. In a free market, high prices are a signal. They tell farmers to grow more corn, raise more cows. They tell buyers to conserve. It balances out. But we didn't have a free market. We had a political one. The official price of steak was a lie. The real price of steak was hidden. It was the cost of the chicken feet. It was the risk of jail. It was the bribe you paid to the wholesaler. And if I insisted on living by the lie, the official price, I was going to go bankrupt. That afternoon, the shop was empty again. I'd sold the beef. The chicken feet were rotting in the bin out back. I wiped my hands on my apron, trying to get the smell of failure off them. Rosa was at the register, counting the points. We had plenty of points. We had plenty of cash. But we couldn't eat points, and we couldn't butcher cash. Then the phone rang. It was my cousin, Vinny. Vinny was a jobber, a guy who moved things. Not a gangster exactly, just connected. He asked me how the shelves were looking. He asked me if I was tired of Miller ripping me off. I didn't say anything. I just held the receiver, listening to the static. He told me he had a friend, a farmer in Jersey, who had a truck, and who didn't care about the OPA price ceilings. He told me to meet him behind the loading docks at midnight. Bring cash. Leave the ration book at home. I looked at Rosa. She was staring at the ledger, biting her lip. I looked at the photo of my son Joey in his uniform, taped to the cash register. I told Vinny I was a law-abiding citizen. I told him I didn't do that kind of business. He laughed. He said, "Tony, everybody does that kind of business now. It's not crime anymore, it's survival." I hung up. But that night, lying in bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, I couldn't sleep. I kept doing the math. Minus $12 a day? How long until we lost the lease? How long until we lost the apartment upstairs? Joey was fighting Germans in Tunisia. I was fighting bankruptcy in Brooklyn, and I was losing. I got up. I went to the kitchen and took the tin box out of the cupboard. The emergency cash. I told myself I was just going to check, just going to see what Vinny was talking about. That's all. Just looking. But as I put on my coat and walked out into the cool April night, leaving my wife asleep, I knew. I knew the supply chain hadn't just broken. My resistance had broken with it. The silence. That's what I remember most about May of 1943. A butcher shop is supposed to be loud. It's supposed to be a symphony of noise. The heavy thwack of the cleaver hitting the block, the buzz of the saw, the crinkle of wax paper, the gossip flying back and forth between the housewives. It's a place of life. But by mid-May, my shop was quiet. It smelled wrong, too. It didn't smell like raw beef and savory fat anymore. It smelled of bleach and sawdust. It smelled like a hospital. I stood behind the counter at 10 in the morning, staring at my display case. It was pristine. The glass was polished. The white enamel trays were lined up in perfect rows, and every single one of them was empty. Well, not entirely empty. I had 3 pounds of pig's feet and a tray of scrapple, a mix of cornmeal and pork scraps that nobody wanted. But the steaks, the roasts, the chops, they were gone. We were 7 weeks into the meat rationing system. 7 weeks of red stamps, point values, and empty promises. Now, you have to understand something about economics here. The government had printed these beautiful posters. They hung right there in my window. They listed the ceiling prices, the maximum legal price I could charge. According to the Office of Price Administration, a pound of top sirloin cost 55 cents. That was the law. But here is the thing about laws. They can control the price, but they cannot compel the cow. The farmers out west weren't stupid. The cost of feed corn had gone up. The cost of labor had gone up. It cost a farmer maybe 20 cents to put a pound of meat on a steer, but the wholesalers were only allowed to pay them 18 cents. You don't need a degree in finance to do that math. If the farmer sold his cattle to the legal market, he lost money. So he didn't sell. He kept the cows in the field, or he sold them to a private buyer in the middle of the night for cash. The result? The legal supply chain simply evaporated. The 55-cent steak became a ghost. It existed on the government poster, but it didn't exist in my cooler. That Tuesday, the bell above the door finally jingled. It was Mrs. Higgins. She was a small woman, always wore a gray coat that had seen better days. Her husband had died in the Great War, 25 years earlier, and she had raised 4 boys on a seamstress's wage. 2 of them were in the Navy now. She walked up to the glass and looked at the empty trays. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, clutching her ration book like it was a Bible. She asked me, very quietly, if I had anything in the back. Just a little ground beef, maybe a pound. I looked at her. I looked at her hands, rough from needlework. I knew she had the points. She had the money. She had followed every rule the government asked of her. I had to tell her no. I explained that I hadn't had a delivery in 3 days. I told her the truck just didn't come. She looked at me, and her eyes drifted to the back room. She asked if I was sure. She'd heard that the shop on 4th Avenue had meat if you knew the right password. She asked me if I was holding out on her because she wasn't Italian. That hurt. That felt like a slap across the face. I told her, my voice shaking a little, that I didn't care where she was from. I didn't have the meat. She didn't argue. She just turned around and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She just closed it softly. That was worse. I went into the back room and sat on a crate of onions. I put my head in my hands. I felt like a failure. A butcher who can't feed his neighborhood isn't a butcher. He's just a man in a bloody apron standing in an empty room. Then Rosa came in. My wife is the backbone of the Moretti family. I am the noise. She is the structure. She was holding the ledger, the big black book where we tracked the money. She set it down on the cutting block. She didn't sugarcoat it. She pointed to the red ink at the bottom of the page. She told me we were in trouble. Real trouble. We had fixed costs. The rent for the shop and the apartment upstairs was $45 a month. The electricity for the cooler, which had to run even if it was empty, was another $12. Then there was the ice, the paper, the string. She ran her finger down the income column. It was pathetic. $12 in sales for the whole week. You can't pay $45 of rent with $12 of sales. She looked at me with those dark, serious eyes. She asked me what we were going to do. She reminded me that Joey needed packages sent to the front. She reminded me that Clara needed shoes for graduation. I started to talk about patriotism. I started to say that we had to sacrifice, that this was our part of the war effort. Rosa cut me off. She told me that starving wasn't a war strategy. It was just starving. She asked me about Vinny. Vinny was my cousin. I hadn't mentioned him to you yet, mostly because I tried not to think about him. Vinny was a jobber. That's a polite word for a guy who knows a guy. He drove a truck that didn't have a company name painted on the side. I told Rosa absolutely not. I told her Vinny was a crook. Dealing with him was a federal crime. If the OPA caught us, they wouldn't just fine us. They would revoke my license. They would padlock the doors. We'd be on the street. Rosa didn't yell. She just closed the ledger. The sound was loud in the empty room. She told me that if we didn't have anything to sell by Friday, the landlord would put us on the street anyway. She said she respected my principles. She really did. But principles didn't make soup. She left the book on the block and went upstairs to start dinner. Probably potato soup again. I stood there for a long time, staring at that ledger. The numbers were cold. They didn't care about the war. They didn't care about Mussolini or Hitler or the 1st Infantry Division. They just demanded to balance. This is the part of financial history they don't teach you in school. They talk about inflation and supply chains like they are abstract concepts, like weather. But when you're standing there, realizing that the legal price is a lie and the real price is a crime, you don't feel like an economist. You feel like a trapped animal. I realized I had a choice. I could be a good citizen and go bankrupt. I could lose the business I had spent 30 years building. I could fail my wife and my daughter, or I could break the law. I walked over to the wall phone in the hallway. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely hold the receiver. I felt like everyone was watching me. The OPA, the neighbors, even my son Joey, all the way over in Tunisia. I dialed Vinny's number. He answered on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He just asked if I was ready to stop playing games. I told him to bring the truck. The truck engine coughed, a harsh, mechanical hacking sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot through the silent street. It was 2 a.m. In the apartment upstairs, Rosa was awake. I knew she was. We hadn't said a word to each other since she closed the ledger 3 hours ago, the red ink still wet on the page. I sat in the driver's seat of my delivery van, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned the color of sweat. Beside me on the passenger seat sat a tin box. It was the emergency fund. 10 years of squirreling away, $5 here, $2 there. It was supposed to be for a rainy day, or maybe a wedding gift for Clara. Now, it was the price of admission to the underworld. I turned the key again. The engine caught this time, settling into a low rumble. I didn't turn on the headlights, not yet. Under the dime-out regulations, the streetlights were hooded, casting only small pools of yellow on the pavement to keep the city hidden from U-boats prowling the Atlantic coast. Brooklyn looked like a graveyard. I pulled away from the curb, leaving Moretti's quality meats behind. I felt a sickness in my stomach that had nothing to do with the erratic motion of the truck. I had always been a law-abiding man. I bought my war bonds, I flew the flag, I paid my taxes. But the ledger didn't care about patriotism. The landlord didn't accept war bonds for rent. I was heading toward a warehouse district near the Navy Yard. My cousin Vinny had given me the address. Vinny wasn't a bad kid, not really. He'd grown up playing stickball with Joey. But Vinny had always looked for the shortcut, the angle. Before the war, I used to lecture him about honest work. Now I was driving through the dark to beg him for help. The streets were empty. Every shadow looked like an OPA inspector. Every parked car looked like a police cruiser. I found myself checking the rearview mirror every 10 seconds, sweating despite the chill of the May night. You have to understand what happens to a man when the rules of survival contradict the laws of the land. You don't become a criminal overnight. You drift into it. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself it's necessary. You tell yourself you're just feeding people. But driving that truck, I didn't feel like a provider. I felt like a thief. I reached the warehouse. It was a nondescript brick building, the windows painted over with black paint. A single light bulb burned above a side loading bay. I flashed my headlights once, the signal Vinny had given me. The heavy metal door rolled up with a screech of rusted chains. I backed the truck in, the tires crunching over gravel and broken glass. Vinny was there, wearing a suit that was too expensive for a guy who officially worked as a logistics consultant. He didn't smile. He didn't ask about the family. He just pointed to the corner of the bay. There they were, 4 sides of beef. I got out of the truck, and the smell hit me. It was the smell of my life, raw meat, cold fat, iron. It was the smell of a working butcher shop. For a month, my cooler had smelled like sawdust and ammonia. This smelled like salvation. I walked over to the hanging carcasses. I ran my hand along the flank. It was good meat. Western beef, corn-fed, heavy with marbling. Not the stringy dairy cows the legal wholesalers were trying to pawn off on us. Vinny walked up beside me. He told me the price. I almost laughed. It was absurd. He was asking double the OPA ceiling price. Double. I tried to argue. I told him I was family. I told him about Joey in Tunisia, about the rent, about the empty case. Vinny cut me off. He explained the economics of it, cold and simple. He wasn't just charging for the meat, he said. He was charging for the risk. The farmer who sold this cow off the books risked fines. The trucker who drove it here risked his license. And Vinny risked prison. That premium, that extra $1 per pound, was the insurance policy against the federal government. It made sense in a twisted way. When the legal price is set so low that no one can make a profit, the goods disappear from the light and reappear in the dark, carrying the price of danger on their back. I looked at the beef. Then I looked at the tin box in the cab of my truck. I didn't say anything. I just went to the truck, grabbed the box, and handed it to him. Vinny counted the cash. He didn't offer a receipt. In this market, paper trails were death sentences. He just nodded and waved to a couple of guys standing in the shadows. We loaded the meat into the back of my van. It was heavy work, dead weight against my shoulder, the cold fat soaking through my shirt. I was 52 years old, panting for breath, heaving illicit cargo in a dim warehouse while my son fought Nazis in North Africa. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the beef. Vinny slapped the side of the truck when we were done. He told me to be careful. He warned me that the OPA was cracking down, looking for shops with too much inventory and not enough point stamps to account for it. I drove out of the warehouse and back into the maze of Brooklyn. The drive home was worse than the drive there. Now I was carrying the evidence. Every bump in the road made the carcasses sway in the back, a dull thudding sound reminding me of what I'd done. At a red light on Atlantic Avenue, a police cruiser pulled up next to me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I gripped the wheel, staring straight ahead. I tried to look like a tired delivery man, a bored worker on a late shift. I thought about the story I'd tell. A late delivery? A favor for a friend? I glanced sideways. The officer was young, maybe Joey's age. He wasn't looking at me. He was yawning, rubbing his eyes. The light turned green. He turned left. I went straight. I let out a breath that felt like it had been held for a lifetime. When I got back to Carroll Gardens, the neighborhood was asleep. I killed the engine a block away and coasted into the alley behind the shop. I had to be quiet. Mrs. Russo lived 3 doors down, and that woman had ears like a bat. If she heard heavy loading at 3 a.m., the whole neighborhood would know by breakfast. I unlocked the back door of the shop. The air inside was stale. I hauled the beef in, 1/4 at a time, my shoes sliding on the floor. I hoisted them onto the hooks in the walk-in cooler. When the last one was hung, I closed the heavy cooler door and leaned against it, sliding down until I hit the floor. I sat there in the dark, wiping my hands on my trousers over and over again, trying to get the feeling of the grease off my skin. The cooler was full. I had inventory. I could cut steaks, roasts, chops. I could pay the rent. I could look Mrs. Higgins in the eye and tell her I had something for her boys. But as I sat there in the silence of the shop, looking at the empty register and the OPA poster on the wall that read, "Rationing means a fair share for all," I realized something had changed. The Tony Moretti who had locked the door this evening was gone. The man sitting on the floor was someone else. I heard footsteps on the stairs. The door to the apartment opened. It was Rosa. She was wearing her dressing gown, clutching the railing. She looked at me, then at the closed cooler door, then back at me. She didn't ask where the money was. She didn't ask where I had been. She just asked if we were safe. I looked at my wife, the woman who kept the books, who knew exactly how deep the hole was. I told her yes, I told her we were safe. But as I said it, I knew it was the first of many lies I would have to tell. I had the meat. Now came the hard part. I had to sell it. I had to sell illegal beef to honest people, without a single one of them asking why Tony Moretti had steaks when the rest of Brooklyn was eating Spam. I stood up, my knees cracking. I had 3 hours before we opened. I had to break down the sides. I had to trim the fat. I had to hide the evidence of the crime by turning it into dinner. The 4 sides of Western beef hung in the back of my cooler, cold and heavy. To anyone else, they looked like carcasses. To me, they looked like a time bomb, but they also looked like salvation. That morning, I didn't flip the sign to "open" until I had broken down the first side. My hands moved faster than they had in months. This was real meat, not the stringy, bruising dairy cow leftovers the legal wholesalers had been tossing me, but corn-fed steer. The fat was white and hard, the marbling like lace. It was beautiful. It was also completely illegal. I remember the first sale. It was Mrs. Russo. She came in early, her eyes scanning the empty display case, the same way she always did, expecting disappointment. I didn't put the black market meat in the glass case. That was rule number 1. The case was for the inspectors. The case held the liver, the tongue, the few sad pounds of legal hamburger I could scrape together. Mrs. Russo asked if I had anything for Sunday. She mentioned her son Mike was coming off a shift at the Navy Yard and needed strength. She looked at me, and I looked at her. There was a language we learned that year, a silent conversation that happened entirely in the eyebrows. I told her I might have something in the back, just a scrap. I went into the cooler, cut a 3-pound roast, and wrapped it in brown paper before I even brought it out. No weighing it on the front scale, no price sticker. I slid the package across the counter. I whispered the price. It was 3 times the number on the OPA poster hanging right behind my head. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at the poster. She didn't ask for a receipt. She just reached into her purse, counted out the cash, and slid it across the wood. She thanked me, actually thanked me for overcharging her, and tucked the roast deep into her shopping bag under a head of lettuce. That was the moment I understood how we were going to survive. The government thought they controlled the economy with their price ceilings and ration books. But in Brooklyn, the economy was controlled by one thing: hunger. You might wonder how we got away with it, how an entire neighborhood could operate outside the law without the whole thing collapsing. Here's the thing, we were all in on it. It wasn't just me. The baker was buying black market sugar. The gas station owner was trading fuel coupons for tires. We created a circle of silence. If Mrs. Russo reported me to the OPA for overcharging, sure, I'd get fined or shut down. But then where would she get her roast next week? The A&P supermarket down the street had empty shelves. I had meat. Her silence was the price of admission. My wife Rosa became the genius of the operation. If I was the muscle, she was the actuary. The problem wasn't just the cash. It was the points, the red points. See, the OPA checked our books. If I sold 500 pounds of beef, I needed to show the bank that I had collected the equivalent in ration points from customers. But I had bought this black market meat with cash, off the books. I had no invoice for it. If I collected points for it, I'd have a surplus of points that I couldn't explain. If I didn't collect points, customers would have extra points in their books, and they'd wonder why I wasn't taking them. Rosa figured it out. She kept 2 ledgers. The day book lay open by the register, filled with perfect, legal transactions that matched the invoices from the legitimate wholesalers. Then there was the night book. That one lived under the floorboard in the pantry upstairs. For the special customers, the ones we trusted, we sometimes took points just to keep up appearances, then burned them. Literally burned them in the ash can out back. Other times, we traded. I'd give a customer a steak without taking points, and they'd give me something else. A pair of nylon stockings for Clara, a few gallons of gas for the delivery truck. We reverted to a barter system that felt more like the Middle Ages than the 20th century. But the money. The money started to make sense again. For the first time in 6 months, I paid the landlord on time. I paid the electric bill. I paid the wholesaler for the legal bones and fat I still had to buy to keep my cover. I remember one afternoon, Mr. Sterling came in. He was the wealthy man from the Heights, the one I'd almost thrown out weeks before. He walked in with a confidence that made my stomach turn. He knew. Men like him always knew. He asked for a porterhouse. He didn't ask the price. I cut him the best steak I had. He paid me $5 for a piece of meat that the government said should cost 90 cents. He smiled as he left, tipping his hat. I looked at that $5 bill. It felt heavy. It felt dirty. But it also bought my daughter a new pair of shoes for school. That was the trap. You start to justify it. You tell yourself you're providing a service. You tell yourself the government rules are broken, so you're fixing them. But the fear never left. It changed, though. It went from a sharp panic to a dull, constant ache in the back of my neck. Every time the bell above the door chimed, my heart stopped. Was it a customer? Or was it an inspector? The OPA had an army of them. They called them snoops. They were hiring housewives to go undercover, checking prices, weighing packages. I stopped trusting strangers. If I didn't know your face, if I didn't know your mother's name, you got the legal meat. You got the grisly hamburger and the polite apology that we were out of everything else. I became an actor in my own life. I had to perform the role of the struggling, patriotic butcher. I hung more war bond posters in the window. I complained loudly to anyone who would listen about the shortages, about how hard it was to get product. I wiped my hands on my apron and shook my head, playing the victim, while the real inventory sat hidden under a tarp in the back. It changes you. Looking back now, I realize that's what the war did to us at home. It made us liars. It made us suspicious of our neighbors. I remember catching my daughter Clara looking at the new shoes I'd bought her. She asked if business was getting better. I lied to her face. I told her things were picking up. I couldn't tell my 17-year-old that she was walking on the profits of a federal crime. And then there was the inflation. This is the part the history books don't always explain well. They'll show you a chart saying inflation was low during the war because of price controls. Don't believe it. The official price of steak was 40 cents a pound, but there was no steak at 40 cents. The real price The price you actually paid to put dinner on the table was $1.20. The government statistics measured a fantasy world where laws were followed and shelves were full. We lived in the real world, where the dollar was losing value every day, not because the numbers changed, but because you needed 3 times as many of them to buy anything real. By late 1943, I was tired. My eyes had permanent dark circles. I jumped at loud noises. But the ledger upstairs, the night book, was finally showing black ink. We were safe, or so I thought. Then came the letter. Not from the OPA, from the War Department. Rosa brought it into the shop, her face pale as the paper in her hand. It was about Joey. The luck ran out on a Tuesday. I remember it because Tuesday was usually the day Vinny brought the special delivery, the meat we didn't write down in the official ledger. But that Tuesday, Vinny didn't come. Instead, the police came. Not to my shop, thank God not to mine, but 3 doors down, to Ricci's bakery. I stood on the sidewalk, wiping my hands on my apron, watching the spectacle. It was cold, that wet, gray Brooklyn cold that gets into your bones. 2 OPA enforcement officers, men in fedoras with faces like stone, were carrying out boxes. They weren't seizing bread. They were seizing records. Ricci was shouting. I could hear him from 50 feet away. He was screaming that they were ruining him, that he had a family, that he was a patriot. The officers didn't say a word. They just taped a notice to his window. I walked over after they left. The sign was stark and official. It stated in big block letters that the store had violated price ceilings and was closed by order of the Office of Price Administration. A woman from the neighborhood, Mrs. Esposito, was standing next to me. She whispered that it was a shame, mentioning that Ricci gave credit to everyone when times were tight. But then she looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, her eyes weren't friendly. They were suspicious. She was wondering, I knew, if my window was next. I went back to my shop and locked the door. It was 2 p.m. I flipped the sign to closed. Rosa asked me what was wrong, her voice trembling. She'd seen the police cars. I told her we were done. I told her to get the night book, the secret ledger where she tracked the real profits, the black market premiums, the bribes to the wholesaler. She argued with me. She insisted we had bills to pay. She reminded me that Clara needed a coat for graduation, that the rent was due, that without the extra cash, we were back to drowning. She asked me if I wanted us to starve. I didn't answer her. I just pointed to the street where Ricci's dark window stared back at us. You have to understand the psychology of the black market. It only works when everyone agrees to keep the secret. It relies on a shared desperation. But the moment the government makes an example of someone, the moment they put that suspension order in the window, the trust evaporates. Suddenly, your customers aren't your partners in survival. They're potential witnesses. I took the night book to the furnace in the basement. I watched the pages curl and blacken. The record of $3,000 in illegal meat. The proof that I was a criminal. It turned to ash. But burning the book didn't burn away the fear. 3 days later, the telegram came. You know what a telegram looks like in wartime. It's small, yellow, and terrifying. When the Western Union boy handed it to me, my hands shook so bad I dropped it. Rosa couldn't even breathe. She just held the counter, her knuckles white. I opened it. It wasn't a gold star. Thank the Virgin, it wasn't a death notice. It was from the War Department. Joey, wounded in action, near a place called Anzio in Italy, shrapnel in the leg. He was being evacuated to a hospital in Naples. Condition stable. Stable. I sat down on the butcher block. I sat right on the wood where I cut the meat. I looked around my shop. I looked at the new scale I'd bought with black market money. I looked at Clara's new shoes in the corner. I looked at the hidden compartment under the floorboards where I kept the cash, and I felt sick, physically sick. Here I was, charging Mrs. Higgins an extra 20 cents a pound for pot roast, sneaking beef in through the back alley like a thief, terrified of losing my business. And my son? My son was bleeding in the mud in Italy. He was fighting for the country that made the laws I was breaking. It sounds simple now, looking back. A moment of clarity. But in the moment, it felt like I was being torn in half. The justification I'd built, that I was doing it for my family, for Joey, collapsed. I wasn't helping Joey by cheating the system. I was just getting rich while he got shot. That evening, Vinny showed up at the back door. He had 4 loins of beef in his trunk. Beautiful meat. Prime stuff. I told him to keep it. Vinny thought I was joking. He told me I was crazy. He said the price had gone up again, that I could double my money by Saturday. He tried to push past me into the cooler. I blocked the door. I told him I was out. No more side deals. No more cash under the table. No more burning points to hide the inventory. He got angry then. He warned me that if I stopped buying, I couldn't start again. He said the wholesalers would cut me off completely. He said I'd be left with nothing but bone and gristle to sell. He called me a fool. Maybe I was. The next month was the hardest of the war. Vinny was right. The legitimate supply lines were almost dry. I had nothing to put in the case. I had to look customers in the eye, women I'd known for 10 years, and tell them I had no meat. Not no meat for the price, but no meat at all. Our income dropped to nothing. We ate pasta with watered-down sauce for weeks. We turned off the heat in the apartment to save coal. Rosa cried at night because we were dipping into the emergency savings just to pay the rent. But I slept. For the first time in a year, I slept. I realized something then about the economy. When you break the rules, you think you're escaping the system. You think you're being clever, but you're just trading one kind of cost for another. You trade the financial cost for a psychological one. You pay with your peace of mind. The government crackdown didn't catch everyone. Plenty of butchers kept selling on the black until the very end. They made fortunes. They bought houses on Long Island after the war. But every time the door chimed, I didn't jump. Every time a stranger walked in, I didn't panic. I remember Mrs. Russo coming in near the end of 44. Her son Mike was in the Navy. She asked if I had anything special for his birthday. She winked, the way she used to, reaching for her purse to offer the extra cash. I told her I had ground beef, regular utility-grade ground beef, and I told her the price. The ceiling price, 31 cents a pound. She looked at me, confused. She offered more. She thought I was holding out. I told her no. I insisted that was the price. That was the law. She looked at the empty space in my case where the steaks used to be. Then she looked at me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she nodded. She bought the ground beef. She thanked me quietly before she left. She wasn't thanking me for the meat. She was thanking me for something else. Maybe for being honest, or maybe just for suffering the same way she was. The war was turning. You could feel it in the headlines. The Allies were pushing into Germany. The end was coming, and I was broke. I was tired. My son was limping in a hospital bed across the ocean. But I was a butcher, a legitimate butcher, and that had to be enough. It was a Tuesday in November, 1945, when the bell above the door rang. Not the sharp, demanding chime of a customer looking for hamburger that wasn't there, but a hesitant sound. A soft jingle. I was behind the counter, scraping down the butcher block, a habit I couldn't break even when there was no meat to cut. I looked up. Standing there, framed by the afternoon light of Brooklyn, was a young man in a uniform that looked 2 sizes too big. He was leaning on a cane. His face was thin, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes looked older than my father's had when he died. It was Joey. For a second, the world stopped. The price of beef, the OPA regulations, the night book, the fear of the inspector, it all evaporated. I remember dropping my scraper. It hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the silent shop. I walked around the counter. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water. I didn't run. I couldn't. I just walked to him and took him by the shoulders. He felt solid. Real. He told me he was home. He said it quietly, like he didn't quite believe it himself yet. Rosa came out from the back room then. She didn't make a sound. She just collapsed into him, weeping into that wool uniform, holding him like she was trying to put all the broken pieces back together with just the strength of her arms. That night, we closed the shop early. I flipped the sign to "Closed" and locked the door. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't check the street for inspectors. I didn't care who was watching. We sat in the kitchen upstairs. I had saved a roast, a rib roast, bone-in, beautiful red meat with a cap of fat as white as snow. It was legal. I'd bought it with points I'd saved for months, hoarding them for this exact moment. Rosa cooked it simply. Salt, pepper, garlic. The smell filled the apartment, a scent that used to be common but had become a memory. We ate mostly in silence. Joey ate slowly, savoring every bite, his eyes fixed on the plate. He told us later that in the hospital in Naples, he used to dream about Sunday dinner. He said the dream was the only thing that kept the pain in his leg from driving him mad. Looking at him, I realized something. The war had taken his youth. It had taken his stride. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But it hadn't taken him. And the war on the home front? The economic war I had fought with my ledger and my conscience? That was ending too. But the lesson of it, that was just beginning to clear. In the months that followed, the government finally lifted the controls. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't pretty. Now, you might think that once the war was over, prices would go back to normal, back to 1940 levels. That's what the politicians promised us. They said if we just held the line a little longer, the economy would reset. But here's the thing about economics. It doesn't care about promises, it only cares about reality. When the Office of Price Administration finally lost its power in 1946, do you know what happened? Prices didn't go down. They exploded. Almost overnight, the price of hamburger went from the artificial ceiling of 30 cents to 60, then 80. Steaks that were officially 50 cents shot up to $1.50. People were furious. They picketed. They shouted that the butchers were gouging them. But I wasn't gouging anyone. For the first time in years, the price on the tag actually matched the cost of the cow. The black market hadn't been an aberration. It hadn't been a bunch of criminals trying to steal from the working man. The black market was just the real market, screaming to be heard from under a gag order. The nightbook I had burned? It was the only honest ledger I'd kept. It reflected the truth, that when you print money to fight a war and destroy your supply chains, things get expensive. Hiding that truth with a price ceiling didn't fix the problem. It just turned honest men into liars and turned simple commerce into a crime. I remember tearing down the OPA poster in the shop window. The tape had yellowed and fused to the glass. I had to use a razor blade to scrape it off. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. I scraped until the glass was clear. Years later, looking back on it all from the comfort of a different era, I understood the mechanics of it. I understood that the inflation wasn't caused by greedy shopkeepers or unpatriotic housewives. It was the bill coming due. We paid for the war twice. First, with our sons on the beaches of Anzio and Normandy, and second, with the value of our labor and our savings. The government printed billions to buy tanks and planes. That money flooded the system. When the dam of price controls finally broke, the floodwaters rose. But we learned to swim. That's the part they don't put in the history books. They talk about the battles and the generals. They don't talk about the family in Brooklyn figuring out how to stretch a pound of ground beef into dinner for 6. They don't talk about the dignity of paying a debt you didn't incur, just to keep your head high. I look at the news today, and I see the same stories. I hear people talking about supply chains, about inflation, about the government printing money to solve a crisis. I hear politicians blaming store owners for rising prices. And I want to tell them, stop looking at the price tag. Look at the money in your wallet. That's where the story is. But mostly I think about resilience. We survived. That's the headline. Moretti's quality meats stayed open. We didn't get rich, far from it. The inflation of the late 40s ate up most of what we had saved during the war. But we still had the shop. We still had the neighborhood. And I had my son. A few years after the war, Joey took over the counter on Saturdays. He couldn't stand for long shifts because of the leg, so we got him a stool. He'd sit there, wrapping chops in brown paper, joking with the customers. One afternoon, Mrs. Russo came in. The same woman I had almost turned away back in '43, the one whose son was in the Navy. Her boy had made it back, too. She asked for a veal cutlet. I weighed it. It was expensive, 3 times what it cost before the war. I told her the price, feeling that old twinge of guilt, that fear that she would yell or leave. She just looked at me, then at Joey sitting on his stool, then back at the meat. She opened her purse and counted out the coins. She told me it was worth it. She said getting what you pay for, good, honest meat, weighed on a fair scale, sold by a friend, was worth every penny. She was right. We kept the lights on. We fed the neighborhood. We did what we had to do when the world went mad. And when the sanity returned, we were still standing. You can't ask for much more than that. The ledger was balanced, not with money, but with life, and that, finally, was enough.